meeting now, would you like, you and Mr. Strange to be behind you on the wall line? Or are we up?
What did we do here last time?
I
I think
believe
people were just kind of up there.
up there.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. You sure you don't need to?
Well, the AEI facility is, you can pull that off without looking ridiculous, right? I think here, maybe that's not going to work.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent, great. And I'll make sure
Okay.
we'll start, hopefully, pretty promptly. Yeah.
So my staff is giving people.
Henry's not too badly.
Well, so I think it's just a really bad cold. He staggered into my office on Monday, looking sick as a dog, but I already knew he was ill because I could hear the convulsive coughing down the hall. And so I said, I really think you should go home. And then he emailed me how much time he had said, I will. We want you to sit on the front row. Yes, the front rows were getting in the way of the live stream camera, so we had to move that row. That's what they told me.
Do you have a preference? Oh, okay. I dumped my briefcase there, which I'm happy to move if that's in your way.
No, it's fine.
Is somebody going to give me a sign live? Okay. Okay, so
Are you in town just for this?
Yeah. I'm going to go to London for some talks next week.
Oh, fun. Anywhere fun?
New Statesman annual dinner talk and
Great.
a post-liberal conference in Cambridge.
Oh, wow. Who's doing that? Who's doing that?
It's Telos Magazine, do you know them? They were kind
Yeah.
of a heterodox. They like to write synthesis magazine.
That sounds like fun.
Under Paul Coney, who passed away some time ago.
Cambridge is nice. The tech hub. Yeah.
Amsterdam. Yeah, we're right across from St. Matthew's.
Might go to number 10. Let's see. I was there last January under the Conservatives. Went to number 10. I came out, and all these tourists started waving at me like I was a minister. That was fun.
That's funny.
So, but it would be nice to advise Sunak and Starmer and be ignored by both.
Yeah, they're having some trouble right now. That country as a whole is troubled beyond the capability of its government, I fear. They really need somebody to do some radical things that they just don't have the stomach to do.
I agree.
Okay, very good.
Well, good evening. On behalf of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, let me welcome you, both our audience here in person and those online, to the third debate in EPPC's Crossroads of Conservatism series. These debates are made possible by a generous grant from the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and we are very grateful for their support. Those of you who have attended our have begun to suspect that I am not Henry Olson, and your intuitions are sound. Henry is a senior fellow at EPPC, and he is the prime mover and guiding mind behind this debate series. Unfortunately, he is also under the weather. I'm Mitchell Muncy. I'm the Executive Vice President of EPPC, and I will stand in for Henry this evening. So, trade policy, an issue perhaps somewhat obscure to the average person, but whose effects are nevertheless broad and deep. What should we hope for, or perhaps brace ourselves for, when the new administration takes over in 6 weeks? Is it ever in the national interest to interfere in existing free trading relationships, whether through tariffs, subsidies, or some other mechanism? If so, by what means should we accomplish the interference? Are all of our trading relationships really as free as we would like or would like to think? To help us explore these matters, we have this evening two distinguished scholars who will take up the question, should American trade policy prioritize support for a dominant industrial base, even if doing so requires levying tariffs and expanding government subsidies? Arguing the affirmative of this question will be Michael Lind. He is co-founder of New America and co-author of its manifesto, The Radical Center. A columnist for Salon, he also writes frequently for the New York Times and the Financial Times, and is the author of numerous books, including, most recently, Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. Arguing the negative will be Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies and Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He publishes frequently in leading academic and policy journals and is the author of the 2020 book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It, which Michael has graciously made available out on the registration table. Please take one. The structure of tonight's debate will be somewhat different from our previous two. Each speaker will start by offering 5-minute opening remarks, followed by a 45-minute period of mutual questioning, which I will moderate for brevity and focus. We'll conclude with 30 minutes of questions from the audience. We will accept questions only by email this evening. Please send your question to events@eppc.org. That's events@eppc.org. Michael Lind, arguing the affirmative.
Thank you, and thanks to the Ethics and Public Policy Center for this entire series and not just inviting me to take part in this debate. I will support the motion that we should prioritize, I won't say a dominant, but a competitive industrial base, even with the need for tariffs and subsidies, by citing Adam Smith, the patron saint of free marketeers, who in The Wealth of Nations famously says, as defense is more important than opulence, 18th century word for wealth, the Navigation Acts are among the wisest acts of British legislation. So what were the Navigation Acts? They required that all imports to Britain be carried to British ports on ships that were entirely constructed in Britain itself. So in other words, a Dutch ship could not land in a British port when Adam Smith was writing and unload products from the continent. A British ship had to pick it up in Amsterdam or another port, Hamburg somewhere, and then bring it to Britain. And in addition, under British law at the time, people were severely punished for allowing their hogs to run wild and eat acorns, because it was British policy to grow as many tall oaks, which could then be converted into the British civilian shipping, merchant marine. And so why did the British do this between Cromwell and the 19th century? Because as an island, they were completely dependent on having a navy to shield them from the much greater land powers of Europe. And so Adam Smith said, this is a growth violation of the idea of free trade, but it's important because national security comes first. On shipping, by the way, China our major geopolitical adversary, if you think as I do that we're now in Cold War II, made almost no ships a few decades ago. Shipbuilding was dominated by Japan and South Korea. Today, purely as a result of subsidies and all kinds of government intervention, China builds about a third of the world's ships. Do you know how many civilian ships, like container ships, the United States makes? 0.10%. 10% of 1%. That's what we make. We used to make more. In the 1930s, one of the first things President Franklin Roosevelt did was to create a shipping differential subsidy, where from the 1930s up until the 1980s, the federal government matched any foreign government subsidy for shipbuilding. So we made civilian ships, not a huge share of the global market, but we made them. The Reagan administration came along and, listening to free market economists, said, why do we need to build ships? Why do we have to have a merchant marine? We can just buy our ships from other countries. So Reagan destroyed one of the major industries that China, South Korea, Japan, and India, and Brazil, they all have policies to promote container ships. And it's like aerospace, or it's like automobiles. It's high tech, labor intensive, lots of jobs, super important global markets, and it was thrown away because of free market ideologues in the Reagan administration. China now, again using not free market techniques, but subsidies and various forms of protectionism and regulation, makes 80% of the civilian drones in the world are made by one Chinese company, DJI, a single Chinese company. 90% of the civilian drones that are used by police departments and county sheriffs in the United States are bought from DJI, from China. We helped to invent the drone industry using German World War II buzz bomb technology. We don't make drones. We import them from China. So you just go down the list. China yesterday announced that it was embargoing antimony, germanium, and gallium. 50% of the germanium and gallium that the US military depends on for military hardware and for advanced chips comes from, guess who? China, our strategic adversary. So if Professor Adam Smith were here, he would say on national security grounds alone, you can debate all you want about free trade with Canada or other allies, but the main reason for preserving your industrial dominance is national security. So I have other points, but I can make them after this introduction. Thank you.
Michael Strain, arguing the negative.
Well, thank you very much to the Ethics and Public Policy Center for having Michael and I here to discuss this and for the entire series, which I think is great and is a contribution to not just the political right, but to the entire policy and political communities. Thanks to my friend Henry for asking me specifically to do this, and hope Henry feels better soon. Should American trade policy prioritize support for a dominant industrial base, even if doing so requires levying tariffs and expanding government subsidies? I think the answer to that question is clearly, in my judgment, no. And I will offer 6 reasons as to why that is. First, this strikes me as a solution in search of a problem. Should we prioritize harmful policies if we can get a dominant industrial base? That's the question. And the fact is that the U.S. is a global manufacturing powerhouse. This fact seems to be lost in the debate about trade policy and economic policy generally. But concern about the erosion of our manufacturing capability is wildly overstated. U.S. industrial production and manufacturing output are each near record highs. The U.S. Manufacturing value added is the second largest in the world, And if you add up 3, 4, 5, 6, you still don't quite get to where the United States is. It is true that we've fallen behind China, but it is a wild overstatement to argue that our manufacturing base is somehow hollowed out, or that we don't make things here anymore, or any of the sound bites that you hear from politicians in both parties. Reason number 2, if you want a dominant industrial base or a more dominant industrial base, then pursuing policies that will weaken our manufacturing companies is not a good way to achieve that goal. Protectionism makes U.S. manufacturing less competitive. We don't have to go all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs during the Depression era to demonstrate this. We can go back to 2018 and 2019 when President Trump launched his trade war. That war invited retaliation from other nations. It increased the cost of doing business to domestic manufacturers. Simply put, being a manufacturing company became more expensive because to manufacture things in America, you need to import things from abroad. So even if we stipulate that the U.S. should be more dominant in manufacturing, protectionism will make us weaker, not stronger. Reason number 3, protectionism hurts other sectors as well. Losses in foreign trade with retaliatory countries outweighed gains from trade from non-retaliatory countries by more than $14 billion in the most recent trade war in the agriculture sector. And so these trade policies don't just damage import sectors, they damage other sectors as well. The 4th reason is that this discussion is a little bit ill-defined. The United States just embarked on a round of subsidies in order to advance our industrial base. And one of those subsidies was the CHIPS Act, which passed with bipartisan support and which has been promised to increase the U.S.'s production of semiconductors on national security grounds. The Semiconductor Manufacturing Association, not exactly a disinterested party, projects that as a consequence of the CHIPS Act, by 2032, the U.S. will produce 14% of global chips. Currently, the U.S. produces 12%. That is a 2 percentage point increase. Are we more resilient? Are we more secure? Are we more safe? Have we revitalized manufacturing? Are we a major chip producer if we go from 12 to 14? Some might say yes, but I think that at best that's a subjective judgment. What this is really about is not about a manufacturing base or manufacturing capacity. It's really about employment. But again, the evidence shows that President Trump's trade war in 2018 and 2019 reduced manufacturing employment rather than increased manufacturing employment. Moreover, the narrative about trade and jobs is mostly wrong. Research shows that trade with China did reduce manufacturing employment by something like 200,000 jobs per year from 1999 to 2011. In a typical month, 5 million workers separate from their employers in the United States. In a typical month, 350,000 manufacturing workers separate from their employers. So 200,000 jobs per year may sound like a lot, but in the context of American dynamism, where in a typical month, 5 million workers are separating from their employers, or in a typical year, 60 million workers are separating from their employers, the disruption from trade is properly understood to be overstated. I am getting a stop sign, and so I'll stop there. Look forward to the discussion.
So now we'll begin 45 minutes of mutual questioning with the potential for interventions from me, including this one to start things off. I'd like for each of you to spend a few minutes defining what you think the specific areas of disagreement are between you, and perhaps more important, what are the foundations or the principles that create those disagreements? So, Michael Lind.
Well, I think we agree that the employment argument for protectionism is overblown. The majority of Americans are in the non-traded domestic service sector, and if you had 50% tariffs, that would be true. In fact, it would probably be accelerated because I think we would have more automation as a result, not more manufacturing jobs. So I think we agree on that. Where we disagree, and it's a profound disagreement, is national security. Michael did not mention great power rivalries, but most of world history since the origin of the United States, which originated in a world war between France and Britain, has involved constant great power clashes where each great power tries to minimize its dependence on other countries in general, but particularly on the adversary power. So do you think that we are engaged in a geopolitical conflict now, a national security conflict now, with China, the world's largest manufacturing power, which surpassed us some time ago? And should we be concerned about China or any possibly hostile great military industrial power in the future?
So imagine that there were a pill that everyone in America had to take every day, or they would suffer some sort of horrible adverse health effect. And now imagine that pill were manufactured in Beijing. You know, that would be a problem. And even the strongest supporter of free markets and free trade would identify that as a problem and would be eager for the government to step in and take measures to address that. I think that it's quite reasonable to argue that certain advanced semiconductors are kind of like that pill, and I think it's reasonable to argue that certain chemicals that are used for important medicines are kind of like that pill. I don't think it's reasonable to argue that T-shirts and children's toys are like that pill. And so I think that yes, the United States is in a strategic rivalry with China, and that is increasingly aggressive and of increasing concern, and that rivalry justifies some interventions in free markets. I think the difference between this great power rivalry and great power rivalries of the past is that it's taking place in a world with substantially more economic linkages between countries. And it seems to me that, again, tariffing T-shirts and children's toys doesn't do anything to advance the U.S.'s position in that rivalry, has the potential to escalate the rivalry in a way that works against U.S. security interests. And the challenge for the U.S. government is to figure out how to execute a strategy against a rival in a world where there's lots of cross-border flows of goods in a way that there wasn't 100 years ago or 100 years before that. I think if you wanted to try and figure out maybe the worst way to execute that strategy, it would be to unilaterally engage in protectionist measures against not only that rival, but also against our allies. blocking the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel, putting tariffs on Canada, putting tariffs on Mexico, putting tariffs on the European Union, or in the case of President Biden, subsidizing domestic production in a way that created acrimony with those nations. And so, I think there's a tendency in this debate for someone to make an economic argument and his opponent to say, but national security, and then for the person making the economic argument to say, oh, I surrender. And that I think is not a productive way forward. National security is not a trump card, and it's incumbent on people who are concerned about national security to identify why the trade measures that are being offered actually advance national security. In the case of the Trump and Biden administration, most of them clearly don't. And instead, national security, I think, is used as a fig leaf to justify what's little more than rank protectionism for political purposes or to support domestic manufacturing employment rather than domestic manufacturing capacity.
So you answered his question, but you didn't answer the question of what you think is the foundational or principal disagreement between the two of you on this issue. How you would state that in a couple of sentences.
I don't know. But maybe I'll know more later.
Okay, great. So Michael Lind.
Well, I think if we're going to have a constructive debate, Mr. Strain should not caricature my views.
Oh, I'm not
I did not suggest anywhere that we tariff T-shirts or trivial things. I am not here to defend any actions taken or proposed by the Biden administration or by the Trump administration. So we can have a debate about Michael Lind's views, but it's not a rebuttal of my views when you cite political rhetoric, and by other people. So if the moderator, if that's the rules going forward, I'll be glad to continue the debate. Now, I'm glad Mr. Strain raised the pill, because it so happens that 78% of major vitamins in the United States, B6, B12, and so on, are imported from China. It's literally the pill you're talking about. 30% of APIs, of pharmaceutical ingredients in the United States, come from China. Most of the remainder come from India. The United States not only does not make its vitamins that people take every day, it imports them from our geopolitical adversary, China, but it also is incapable. We don't have the production facilities to make the basic chemical precursors for most medicines in the United States, as we found out during the COVID pandemic. But so just to make it clear, I am not in favor of indiscriminately putting tariffs, or for that matter, subsidizing things randomly. And to be clear, I am against protectionism being used as a fig leaf for corrupt lobbies. We can agree on that. I think there's a serious question. Can you be a significant military power in the 20th century, or 21st century for that matter, in the 19th or 20th, unless you have a largely independent manufacturing base? And I suspect that's the major point of dissension.
Yes, so I should have been more clear. I did not intend to ascribe your views to the typical views of protectionists in both parties. I do think it's important to point out what those arguments are.
I'm against corrupt fig leaf protectionism.
Yes, that does not put you in as large a company as I would like in Washington, unfortunately. And I think I do think it's important to discuss what's being debated in the public square and to discuss the policies that have now been pursued by the most recent presidents of both parties. Do I think that in order to be a great power, you have to be able to make a lot of stuff? I think historically the answer is yes. But again, I think I think the United States can make a lot of stuff. The United States does make a lot of stuff. The United States is the second most powerful manufacturing economy in the world. And so, why should we be excessively concerned about our ability to make stuff? Stipulating that we need to do something about semiconductors, we need to do something about medicines. You can make a list of the things that we should be trying to figure out solutions for, and it's not a very long list. Apart from those items, why should we be concerned about our manufacturing capacity?
I'll take that as a question. Well, the reason is, if you want to be a great military power in the age of manufacturing from the 1800s onwards, there are two ways to do it. One is you have a bespoke, customized, purely government-funded military factories for whatever the important strategic industry of the day is. It could be muskets or whatever. The United States had that. It was called the arsenal system. It was a socialist system of military manufacturing created by President Washington in Congress, in the first Congress. And we had it all the way up until World War II, when we began having defense contractors. And to this day, there's still the Navy and the Army still have some arsenals. What we found out from experience was you can't possibly spend enough money on the surge capacity of ordnance, for example, guns in the 19th century, and the conversion capacity in the 20th century. It's just too expensive. So the cheaper alternative that the United States has used for 200 years is to protect basic manufacturing capabilities in particular sectors, not manufacturing in general, particular sectors. And then in wartime, the arsenals, when we had them, would then lease out contracts to the private manufacturers who would then undergo defense conversion. So for example, the fact that we could have imported all of our cars in the 1920s and 30s from Britain. I mean, the Europeans invented the modern car. We mass-produced it behind a wall of tariffs. But the reason why those were all American car companies was protectionism. The fact that we had the world's largest automobile manufacturing base in 1941 meant that Ford could convert to manufacturing airplanes and tanks, okay? And that was the cheaper method than maintaining a permanent giant tank socialist industry and a permanent socialist, military jet industry. And all the way up until the end of the Cold War, in the 1990s, the president had a list of the CEOs of the major manufacturing companies in the United States, so that if we had a World War II type situation, again, if it's an atomic war, it's over in 5 minutes, then he would call them and say, we're going to switch to military production. So that's my answer to your question. That is, if you want to save the taxpayers money, and you anticipate having to ramp up military production in the future, it's almost impossible to do that, to have that civilian surge capacity and conversion capacity if the civilian industries are not there. And we've discovered this to our pain in the war in Ukraine. Russia now is a country with 140 million people. It's slightly more populous than Japan. It's 1/5 the size of the European Union, okay? They are producing more munitions from their factories for the Ukraine war than the US and NATO combined. So we still live in this world, and Russia was able to do that because they had these civilian factories that they then converted to military production. Do I ask a question now?
That's what we're supposed to be doing. Right?
Yes, that's right. So,
Okay.
so please ask, yes.
Okay, India has levied 70 to 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada has levied 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The United States has done that under Biden. The European Union has levied prohibitive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Are they all irrational and don't understand economics?
I think yes. I think so. I think they could point to concerns about automobiles that might have technology embedded in them that China could use aggressively. China flicks the switch, and every Chinese manufactured car in Canada shuts off or starts going 200 miles an hour and slams into walls or something like that. And I'm not privy to classified information, and I'm not sure how serious of a threat that is. It certainly seems like the kind of thing that we should be at least looking into, and if such a threat exists, perhaps 100% tariff is not.
Just to clarify, I don't think this is about the Chinese having back doors and crashing your cars in the Autobahn in Germany. It's about losing the European automobile industry to import competition, and the Japanese and the Indian and the American.
No, that's where I was getting. So there you hear a national security rationale from some members of that community about allowing Chinese vehicles into countries, but the real issue is protecting the domestic industry, and I don't see, if your concern is the environment and your concern is accelerating the green transition, then making electric vehicles more expensive for your consumers and for the citizens of your country seems like a strange decision. If your goal instead is to support employment in that sector in your country, then I think we have quite a bit of evidence that China is pretty good at retaliating, and any help to domestic employment from import protection is going to be more than offset by harm from retaliatory actions. If your concern is not so much employment, but is instead kind of establishing your country as a location of technological innovation, then I think that tariffs on EVs kind of misunderstands the nature of technological diffusion, and China's still doing the technology there, and technology is porous and diffuses, and tariffs are not a great tool to stop that diffusion. And so it's hard for me to identify a goal that those tariffs will advance. We have to draw a distinction, I think, between the intention of a policy and the actual effect of that policy. So maybe I should turn the question around on you and ask you to tell me, where do you think I'm wrong? What goal am I missing?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a good topic to raise, which is that tariffs and also subsidies have different purposes. So there's not a single thing called the tariff with a single purpose. So historically, there have been three major goals of tariffs, and sometimes subsidies as well. One is national security. You don't care what it costs to consumers. You want that industry to be local, and you either raise taxes on all taxpayers and then use subsidies. And Alexander Hamilton, in the Report on Manufactures in 1791, actually argues that that's, from the consumer's point of view, that's better. subsidies are better than tariffs because it falls on all taxpayers, not just on the consumers of the product, although he favored both subsidies and tariffs. So that's, it's just a cost of national defense, right? So if we're dependent on gallium and germanium for China, we've got enormous mines in the United States. We shut them down because it was dirty and the environmentalists objected, but we can get it up and running and become completely self-sufficient. That's national security rationale. The infant industry rationale is that you force your consumers to buy what may initially be more expensive and shoddier products than the imports from a more advanced technological nation, until through learning by doing and through economies of scale, you gradually catch up, and at that time, maybe you liberalize trade. Every single industrial nation in the world today, without exception, industrialized using import substitution tariffs. There is not a single major industrial country. Britain from the 16th century up until the 1840s, massively protectionist. It built up the world's biggest industry, and only then did it liberalize. The United States, from the 19th century up until 1945, behind the wall of tariffs, we built up the world's greatest manufacturing base, and only then did we liberalize. Germany, Japan, China today, South Korea, you name it. No country has ever become a manufacturing power by free trade, except for small countries that got transnational corporations, to open up a factory in them because of cheap labor or something. But so that's the infant industry. And the third one, the third rationale, is a bargaining chip, which President Trump is running, in my view, rather wild and loose with. It's like it's a new toy. But it's in the narrow sense, you use a retaliatory tariff. You match, it's reciprocal trade. Okay, so if the French have tariffs, then you have tariffs on their products. On the other hand, if they lower theirs, we'll lower ours. And again, to refer to the wealth of nations, Adam Smith has a passage saying this is necessary. If other countries have tariffs against your goods, you should retaliate with tariffs. Hopefully they'll be temporary until they lower them. So those are, so my question to you is, of those three uses of tariffs, national security, infant industry, and bargaining chip, are there any you would support?
No, not at least in a blanket sense as applied to the United States in the year 2024. I agree with your summary of the kind of theoretical arguments about why we might use tariffs. I don't see how any of them apply to the U.S. importing electric vehicles. I don't see how any of them apply to Canada importing electric vehicles. The only one that might is the bargaining chip justification, but the Biden administration had 4 years to, and I'm not suggesting that you're defending the Biden administration, but just to put this in the context of current policy debates, the Biden administration had 4 years to bargain with China, to come up with something that they wanted in exchange for reducing the tariffs that President Trump put in place, and that didn't happen. Instead, we just got more tariffs. And so, if I was the Secretary of the Treasury in the early 19th century and I really wanted to, build up a textile industry, might I agree with Alexander Hamilton about the importance of infant industry protections in a kind of global industry? This is not a crazy view in my judgment, and there's some evidence to suggest that for a developing nation trying to break into a global market with a relatively homogeneous global product, that the optimal tariff rate is not zero. but the United States is not a low-income country trying to increase employment writ large through a manufacturing strategy designed to break into a global market with a homogeneous product. And so, the kind of theoretical rationale for positive tariff rates, for tariff rates above zero, I think collides with the reality of the United States in the year 2024.
So we'll pause for just a moment here to issue a last call for audience questions. Please send your questions to events, EVENTS, at eppc.org. So, Michael Strain, do you have another question for Michael Lind?
Yes. What do you think Canada will get out of that 100% tariff on Chinese EVs?
Well, Canada, like Mexico, is deeply integrated into the North American automobile production network. And unlike, let's say, iPhones, which are almost completely manufactured in China, except there's some reshoring to Vietnam and India, and Brazil has always had tariffs to manufactures their own iPhones from Apple. The automobile industry is very regionalized. There's a European one centered on Germany. There's the North American one centered on the US with Canada and Mexico. So the basic question is, and I guess this is turning my question back to you, if consumers are better off buying efficient, cheap Chinese automobiles from like state-backed, state-subsidized Chinese companies, but even let's say they were pure free market companies, should the US and Canada and Mexico, should North America then just stop making cars? We wouldn't have an automobile industry. We could import all of our cars from China. Would that be the right policy?
I think that that's an excellent question. And auto manufacturing has a special place in American culture. But if the United States were to be in a situation where we could import all the automobiles that we needed at less expense than we can make them here, that would free up a whole lot of capacity for workers to get better jobs, for capital to be put to more efficient uses, and for the basic logic of comparative advantage and exchange to take hold, that would make the United States a more prosperous, wealthier nation. And absent a pretty compelling national security argument that I haven't encountered, I think that under those circumstances, that would be a positive thing for long-term prosperity in the United States. I don't think it's the situation that we're in now, but it is completely conceivable to me that it might be the situation that we're in at some point in the future. In addition, I think it's important here to draw a distinction between manufacturing capacity and manufacturing employment. So manufacturing output in the United States is near its all-time high. Manufacturing employment certainly is not. We do produce cars here. We can produce cars here. We're just producing them with many fewer workers. And again, I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but I think that a lot of the debate about this confuses those two things, and leaves people with the impression that we can't make things here, we don't make things here, when in reality we're making more in America than we ever have.
Do you have a question for me? Do you have a question for him?
No, I do not.
Can I ask myself a question?
Sure.
I want to get their question.
If you were going to ask me a question, I would say, well, do you think there's a difference between industries and value apart from military strategy? And my answer to your hypothetical question is yes. It's called the terms of trade. Now, if you've heard that phrase, it's usually used in commodity exporting countries, often in the third world, complain they have bad terms of trade compared to the manufacturing countries. And that gets into the phrase value added, which you may have heard. Okay, so the concept of value added is very simple. Let's say you have a silicon chip. That's very high value added because the components are quite cheap. It's basically sand, right? It's silica. But if you have a country that exports silica to another country that makes the chips, most of the value added is in the manufacturing and in the science and technology and engineering and the skilled workforce and the factories, okay? So the silica exporting country is going to have to export enormous amounts of raw sand in order to get one silicon chip of the same value. And this explains something which is overlooked by most of the free market economists and neoliberals. If you mentioned comparative advantage. If countries specialized according to comparative advantage, you would expect every industrial country to specialize in a different product, right? We've never seen this in the world. In fact, if you look at industrial nations, most of their trade is in similar high value added products. So Germany sells cars to the US sells cars to Germany, and so on. Japan, sells electronics to the US sells electronics to Japan. Somalia exports raw materials to Germany and raw materials to Japan, and they quite rightly think this is a bad deal for them. And the reason I raised this, in the case of the United States, you keep saying the United States has aggregate manufacturing is bigger than ever. Well, that's true of all countries that are just growing, right? Even India has more aggregate manufacturing. It's the pattern of manufacturing. We are becoming a country where the pattern looks like that of a third world resource colony. The major exports of China to the United States in 2022, the latest data I have, were broadcast equipment, computers, and office machine parts, right? They're the manufacturing center of the world. Of the top 3 exports of the US to China, only one of them was manufactured. It was silicon chips, where we still have this edge we're trying to keep. The other ones were soybeans and petroleum. And in terms of value added, soybeans at $18 billion worth of US exports were twice as high as silicon chips, as 9.61. So that is a non-military concern. That is, China will say, well, we will export the high value added manufacturers where all the money is, and you will have to make it up to us, purely bilateral trade, obviously it's more complicated than that, by providing us with soybeans and farm products and pork rinds and oil and gas. And even if there were no geopolitical conflict between the US, you don't want to lose your manufacturing and be a low value added commodity exporting country, with one exception. If you're like Saudi Arabia or Dubai or something, and you're sitting on an enormous amount of oil and you have a few people, then you can be fairly prosperous. But if you have 330 million people, you don't want to lose your manufacturing industries and export commodities.
Sounds like a good argument in favor of eliminating agriculture subsidies.
All right, well, we can go to audience questions now. We have a number of them. Since Michael Lind asked himself a question, it's a little hard for me to know where to begin, but I think we'll start with a question for Michael Strain. All levels of American government interfere in and thereby distort free markets through taxation, subsidies, and government programs. The goal for each is that the society will be better off through such interventions, even if the aggregate level of production and wealth is diminished. Mm-hmm. Why should we exempt international trade from the same sort of calculus we make for domestic economic activity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't, I don't think we should be excessively ideological about this. Why be, why am I a no on this resolution? I'm a no on the resolution because I think that tariffs and subsidies would weaken the U.S.'s, I forget the precise wording of the resolution, would weaken the U.S.'s industrial capacity. And I think we have seen that that is the case. We saw that President Trump's trade war reduced manufacturing employment, did not increase manufacturing output, raised costs to domestic manufacturers, raised prices for consumers, and did not materially weaken economic ties between the U.S. and China. And so, it just seems like a bad policy, even apart from any sorts of appeals to the beauty of free markets or any sort of libertarian or neoliberal ideology. We do tax things, as the questioner said, and we should try to do that in a way that's that kind of does the least economic damage. But we need tax revenue, and so you gotta if you want to have government spending, you gotta pay for it. You need tax revenue. You gotta do it in the you should be trying to do it in the least harmful way, knowing that whatever you're going to do is going to introduce some sorts of distortions, and that's something that only anarchists would quite literally only anarchists would be opposed to. I think we should be applying a similar logic to the debate about the U.S.'s industrial capacity. We don't want semiconductors produced in Taiwan. Fine. We want we're concerned about the exposure of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry to our increasingly aggressive relationship with China. Fine. What's the best way to address that? And again, not ascribing this view to Michael, but ascribing it to like the leaders of both political parties who are setting the policies. It doesn't seem to me that putting tariffs on T-shirts and children's toys is a reasonable way to address it.
So the next question is for Michael Lind. Given the enormous problems with government's capacity to actually deliver on its intentions in this country, why do you think that more government intervention in the economy with regard to international trade can lead to substantial benefits for average Americans?
Well, because the United States government has been corrupt and incompetent since 1789, if not 1776. And we nevertheless conquered North America, replaced the British Empire as the world's dominant superpower. And having ceded manufacturing supremacy to China, we're still one of the dominant superpower in many other respects. Edward Luttwak, the foreign policy analyst, used to answer critics of Pentagon spending who said, well, there's all this waste, fraud, and corruption. I think Mr. Musk has raised this again. And so Luttwak said, well, just add 15% to all defense budgets for waste, fraud, and corruption, right? He also famously noted during the Cold War when people said, well, we don't need to worry about the Red Army, they're all a bunch of drunks. And he said, yeah, they were drunks when they defeated Napoleon, and they were drunks when they defeated Hitler. So every policy in America is going to be gamed by some lobbyist, and you want to minimize that. But at the end of the day, you have to do things even if some people get paid off on the side. And I think our policy, our grand strategy was admirably summed up by George Friedman, the former director of Stratfor, National Security Consulting Policy. He said the grand strategy of the United States is to be so big and rich that we can survive our own stupidity.
So the next question is for Michael Strain. You've drawn a distinction between industrial capacity and industrial employment. But couldn't an increase in industrial employment be beneficial, especially given the growing listlessness of young men in America and the fact that arguably too many people attend college and don't enter blue-collar work?
Yes, I mean in the abstract, sure. I think that it is important to increase the rate of employment in the United States. It's arguably particularly important to increase the rate of employment among men in the United States, or perhaps even young men. Certainly, prime age men in their late 20s to early 50s. And it would be I think fine from a labor market perspective if some of those jobs were in the manufacturing sector. But I think we should be agnostic in a sense about where those jobs are. I think a lot of the debate that we're having about this, the facts that are being used in the debate are a couple of decades out of date. The average wage in the services sector is now a little bit higher than the average wage in the manufacturing sector. And so the idea that we should be giving special attention to manufacturing employment because those are quote unquote better jobs, I think was true at points in the last half century, but is arguably no longer true and is increasingly I think no longer true. And so our goal should be to increase employment, but I think to let the market kind of figure out where those employment gains should go, because that's the way to actually like put a lot of these guys on a path to self-sufficiency and to give them a real career, rather than a job that depends on tariffs or a job that depends on industrial subsidies.
Question for both of you. Given America's greater adaptability and innovation, should we fear a trade war with China if this is necessary to establish fairer trade?
Well, before answering that, let me just say we're in violent agreement about the jobs thing. Manufacturing jobs are not inherently good jobs, right? That's why corporations moved them from the U.S., where you had unions that ensured high wages, first to the anti-union South, where, as you point out, the Southern factory jobs are so crappy and poorly paid that it's below service jobs in some places. And then that was too high for the greedy corporations, so they moved them to Mexico and China and Bangladesh. What makes a job good, as I argue in my most recent book, Hell to Pay, How the Suppression of Wages is Destroying America, is the bargaining power of workers, which is based on various things, because wages are not fixed magically by productivity or something. That's an academic myth. Most firms have some wiggle room in terms of how they divide profits between shareholders, CEOs, and workers. And if the workers have sufficient bargaining power, they can compel the managers to cut into the CEO payments and the dividends and have higher wages. The reason we think manufacturing jobs were great in the 50s is because in the 1920s, they were terrible jobs, putting coal into steel furnaces and being on this mindless, monotonous assembly line, but because they were unionized in the 1930s and particularly in the 1940s. And then in the 50s, it had nothing to do with the manufacturing. It was because they were unionized. And the reason we think that nursing aid jobs are terrible and low paid and no American would want to do it, and we have to get poor immigrants, is because we failed to unionize the service sector. At the same time, we unionized the manufacturing sector. In European countries, where you have service sector unions, like Denmark, 67% of Danes belong to a union. McDonald's workers, that's a middle-class job with benefits. It's not a terrible job, only poor immigrant helots from other countries would do. So we agree about that. And so can you repeat the question about the fairness?
Oh, should we fear a trade war with China if that's necessary in the longer term to establish a fairer trade relationship between the United States and China?
Well, I'll just answer that briefly, and then Michael can answer. I think whenever you start a war or you find yourself defending yourself in a war, you should have a vision of what the peace looks like, right? Like what comes after this war? It's not going to last forever. So my own view is the U.S. has 4% of the world's population and falling. Most of the growth is taking place in Africa and parts of South Asia. And China's share will shrink as well. But basically, you will have 4 centers of global population and GDP in the future, in the next century. North America, Europe, East Asia, mainly China, and South Asia, India, mostly. And then Africa eventually may catch up, but that will take longer. So we can't dominate world markets the way we did briefly after World War II. That's never going to happen again. I think, and I'm confident in predicting this, I don't think we're ever going to see a rule-governed global market, ever. The only way you can have a rule-governed global market is if you have one power, like the US appeared to be in the 1990s, is so supreme militarily that the other countries decide not to give up military competition. And if you give up military competition, then it doesn't matter, right? We'll just, trade, and then the American Navy will police the world, and we'll have, the Pax Americana. I don't think that was possible even in the 90s and 2000s, but that was the operating theory. It's clearly not. We're moving to a bipolar world now. This Cold War will probably end with a tripolar world, assuming India catches up down the road. And so I think in the long run, every great power is going to engage in a system of mixed trade with the other great powers. They're not going to necessarily be hostile, but they will have free trade in goods that they all benefit from, let's say raw materials, gallium, germanium. When it comes to militarily sensitive industries, I think the Indians, Chinese, Europeans, and Americans will all want their own aerospace companies, and they'll all want their own automobile companies. And you'll have managed trade in some areas, free trade in others. But I think as long as you have a world of multiple great powers, you're not going to have free trade.
I guess I'd kind of reject the premise of the question. I mean, I think we should be worried about a trade war with China. If you talk to an American farmer, they're worried about a trade war with China. I suspect that the largest exporters in the state of South Dakota are worried about a trade war with China. They'll likely be hit by retaliatory tariffs. But I do think at the same time that it is necessary and certainly appropriate for the United States to take some actions to try and get China to behave better. China's behavior as a trading partner has been in gross violation of international norms and of the rules that govern global trade. And that is an unsustainable situation. And whether President Trump or Mrs. Clinton won the 2016 election, this was going to come to a head, and it's good that it did. I think the question is, how best to pursue the objective of getting China to play by the rules, and separately, how best to again make sure that a small number of items that we don't want exposed to an increasingly aggressive relationship between the U.S. and China, can be kind of moved out of China, somewhere else. And I do not think that the trade war from the first Trump administration or the Inflation Reduction Act, or really even the CHIPS Act, are like gonna do a whole lot to address those issues, and they actually might make them worse. And so we end up, I think, with a lose-lose situation where we get all the harm from a trade war with China without making any progress on what should be our actual strategic objectives with respect to China.
So another question for both of you. Isn't the way to make U.S. manufacturing more competitive not tariffs, but rather regulatory reform that makes it less expensive to manufacture here?
No. The reason is, if you treat wage levels as a legitimate part of competition, and if you treat government repression as a legitimate part of competition, as we do, so when we say China is more competitive than the United States, because they don't have free unions to barter for higher wages, they arrest and imprison their labor activists, and they deliberately suppress consumption and payment in order to boost their current account surplus, as Michael Pettis and others points out. This is not economics. This is like, or if it is, it's the most insane theory of economics ever, because if competitiveness is enhanced by political repression and by low wages and poverty of workers, then if Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada were overthrown by the Canadian military, who shot him and created a dictatorship and outlawed Canadian unions and eliminated the minimum wage in Canada, so the average wage is like 50 cents an hour, according to this theory, Canada would have enhanced its competitiveness compared to the US. So this whole notion of competitiveness is fundamentally mistaken in another way, which is this. We talk about competitiveness as though you have the US and China and the EU competing for these third parties out there, right? These other global markets. But in fact, if you put together China, the EU, and India, that's more than half of the world's economy right there, okay? Three giant countries, the US, China, and India, and a multinational bloc, the European Union. And what's more, if you look at who their major trading partners are, they're each other, which makes sense because poor countries don't import a lot because they're poor, right? So this whole competitiveness thing, right? Like American firms are competing with Chinese firms to sell to Ethiopia. Ethiopia's not buying these cars, right? These high value added, they're not buying silicon chips, right? The industrial countries are selling these advanced manufacturers to each other. And so I think we need to just drop this entire concept of competitiveness. It's basically an ideological myth that says the way to be competitive is to lower the wages of workers or get rid of regulations. I mean, maybe some workers are overpaid, maybe some regulations are stupid, but countries, at the end of the day, the world trading system is going to be determined by mostly bilateral negotiations among four major centers of commerce: North America, East Asia, Europe, and India. They're not going to be competing to sell to South America and Africa and so on.
I mean, I think I'm more sympathetic to the view that we need deregulation, it appears, than Mr. Lind. There's a lot of kind of screwy regulation that we have in the United States.
Compared to China?
No, I wouldn't say that compared to China, and even within the United States, when I think about kind of sectors of the economy that are in dire need of regulatory reform, manufacturing does not spring to the top of the list. The housing sector, I think, is, in much greater need for regulatory reform than manufacturing, for example. But in many ways, the kind of labor market more broadly. I mean, if you think about things like occupational licensing restrictions and those sorts of regulations, those are real barriers to mobility and higher wages for workers. But if you wanted to make the to the question, if you wanted to make the manufacturing sector more competitive, I think eliminating Buy America provisions, eliminating environmental review, or at least reforming environmental review, reforming other types of regulations like that, I think would be a reasonable place to start to increase manufacturing competitiveness.
So a question for Michael Lind. Most people would agree that Japan is an important ally of the United States. Should Nippon Steel be allowed to purchase U.S. steel?
I would say no, and the reason is I think we made a mistake during the Cold War of essentially trading access for U.S. military bases to client states and protectorates, like in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, were the most important. In the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, all the way up until recently, whenever there were these debates about, and all of these East Asian regimes, these are not liberal capitalist countries, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. They are mercantilist states. They use all kinds of statist subsidies to their industries. They couldn't use direct tariffs because of treaties, because of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So they use various non-tariff barriers and phony inspections and stuff to keep out Western goods. But they were protectionist, but export-oriented. So they protected their own large internal markets. Japan, second largest capitalist country in population. And then they had essentially unlimited access to the European and American markets. And so that's why they prospered, because in manufacturing industries with increasing returns to scale, Japanese car companies actually had a bigger market than American car companies or European car companies, because our market was the US and Europe minus Japan. Their market was Japan plus Europe and the US, and that made a difference in terms of efficiency. But what happened, and there are good books written about this, whenever there were debates between industry and the national security agencies, the military and the CIA and so on, and the Eisenhower, White House, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, et cetera, and they said, well, the Japanese are like stealing our technology, and they're cheating our firms, and they're keeping our goods out. And same with the South Koreans and the Taiwanese. At that point, the Pentagon would weigh in and say, yes, but we need our bases there. And so the president, it was a Cold War, they said, well, so we lose baseballs, for example. So we lose those little things, the little plastic umbrellas, remember, in drinks that Japan made. It's like, so we lose, like, in the 60s when I was growing up, cameras. Like, we don't have to make cameras, let the Japanese make cameras, okay? The United States invented the television with some help from Britain and Germany. We don't make televisions anymore. They all come from East Asia. The United States' share of global civilian shipping needed to transport American goods around the world, as I pointed, is 0.10%. It's 15% for South Korea, a country with, 50, 60 million people, something like that. So I think we made a strategic mistake. Now, I want us to keep these allies within an American military system, but I do think we have to reshore some stuff from our allies. It seems crazy to me that we allowed chip making. iPhones were made in Southern California, and that's what Silicon Valley is. They were physically assembled there, right, in Silicon Valley, in Northern California. We let it all move to one company, Foxconn, in Taiwan, and then on the mainland of China, right? Who was the genius who came up with this idea? I mean, imagine if in the 1920s, the Harding administration or the Coolidge administration had said, well, maybe there'll be another world war, but Poland is our ally, so we'll just import cars from Poland, right? And if we need them to convert it to fight the Germans, then we'll convert the Polish cars, and then they will ship them over to us, and we'll ship them back. This is just crazy. And that's why the reshoring stuff, I'm sorry to get emotional about this, but it just seems insane to me. They say, oh, well, we'll reshore, we'll fringe shore things. We'll move it from China, our major geopolitical adversary, to Taiwan or Vietnam, a communist dictatorship, or India, which happen not only to have borders with China, but all of which have fought wars with China in the last, since 1945. So when it comes to really fundamental things like steel, which every great power has to be able to produce, then I would be pretty thoroughly protectionist on that. There are other things we can let our East Asian allies and European allies do, and we can import. But I think we made a mistake allowing these American companies to take advantage of cheap labor and access to these markets and government subsidies to partly deindustrialize the U.S. and move things over to these militarily weak countries that are on the border of the world's manufacturing superpower and potentially other military superpower.
So are you going to make a comment? Yeah.
Sure. So, I see this issue differently. I think the Nippon acquisition of U.S. steel would strengthen U.S. Domestic steel production capacity. Nippon wants to put a whole bunch of new technology into U.S. steel, pour a whole bunch of capital into U.S. steel. This is why U.S. Steel's share price fell when it looked like the deal wasn't going to be able to go through. So, if you want a more robust steel industry, in my judgment, domestic steel industry, in my judgment, you should be in favor of this acquisition. On national security grounds, it's hard to imagine that things would turn all that sour between the U.S. and Japan. We just increased our security relationship with Japan during the Biden years. But even if it did, the steel plants are still in America, and if somehow under some circumstances we entered into hostilities with Japan, we could just seize the steel.
You just made the case for tariffs.
I'm sorry?
You just made the case for tariffs.
How did I do that?
Tariffs are perfectly compatible with transplants, okay? So instead of shipping the goods from the foreign country to the American market, to jump over the tariff barrier, they have to produce in the American market, like Japanese transplants and like Korean transplants in the South and so on. So in general, I'm okay with that for the same reason. They're actually building up American industrial capacity. Where I differ is there's kind of a myth that corporations don't have any national identity anymore. And the studies show that there are very few truly global or truly multinational corporations. All of the big name ones are rooted in one country. There's something called the Transnationality Index that the UN publishes every few years. Your typical so-called global corporation has about 40% of its sales in one country, the US, Germany, or Japan being the biggest. And then 60% are sales to other countries. And when you look at boards of directors and shareholders, it's overwhelmingly national. And you see this when there are crises like the Great Depression, where the companies, when you want to regulate them, they say, oh, we're not an American company, we're a global company. We're not a German company, we're global. Then when the Great Recession hits, Opel wants to be bailed out by Germany, Ford, and wants to be bailed out by the U.S. But I agree with you. In fact, I think that as long as there are precautions, I'd be perfectly happy to see tariffs that force China, instead of selling things directly to the U.S. market, to manufacture them in the U.S.
So then why are you opposed to the Nippon acquisition?
Because of the corporate nationality thing. That is, I think that Japan, as it gets older and weaker relative to China, you already see this to some extent with South Korean foreign policy. They're more easily intimidated and bullied by the Chinese. And so are the Australians. There's a big debate in Australia about China pressuring Australian culture to censor itself, right, rather than criticize Japan and threatening retaliation and so on. So I'm not convinced that if we look forward 50, 100 years, that at some point it's rational for Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to say, our chances of standing up to China are kind of like, Jamaica against the U.S. or Haiti or something. And do we really believe the U.S. is going to go to war to defend us? So in the long term, I'm not convinced we will be the dominant power on the western side of the Pacific.
So we have time for one or two more questions, two if we're really quick, otherwise only one. So this one will go to Michael Strain. Do tariffs have any positive role at all to play, perhaps as an incentive for trade deals or other policy changes that we are seeking abroad?
I mean, it's almost impossible to answer that question with the word no. I think that it is certainly conceivable that tariffs could be used as a negotiating tactic to pursue some important outcome. But that doesn't really seem to be what's happening in the United States in the year 2024, even though it conceivably could be something that happens in the United States. And this is the rhetoric you're hearing from some members of the new administration. I think that part of the confusion around protectionism and industrial policy is that it's under both President Trump and President Biden, it's trying to do about 17 things at once, and that creates kind of an incoherence and confusion. And so, do we want these tariffs because we want to cut taxes more in 2025 and they're going to be an important revenue offset? Do we want these tariffs because we think that semiconductors shouldn't be made in Taiwan but should instead be made in swing states in the presidential election? Do we want all this protectionism because we're worried about climate change? Do we want all of it because we want more manufacturing jobs, et cetera, et cetera? But certainly there are some members of the new administration that are arguing for using tariffs in that way, and they're gonna have their shot. But I would like to see a clearly articulated goal. Okay, you want to use tariffs as a negotiating tactic. What are you negotiating over? I think threatening Mexico and Canada with tariffs and making Europe nervous that every export from Europe to the United States is going to be hit by a 10% tariff does not really seem to me like a negotiating tactic in some sort of a rational or coherent process.
So the final question will be for Michael Lind. How do you determine if an industry is important enough to use trade policy to protect domestic production? How do we make that judgment?
Oh, that's easy. All of the military great powers want that industry. And the odds that they are all simultaneously confused that it's important for their military power are pretty low. So in the 19th century, it was steel. It's still steel. Then it was petroleum. Oil became the basis of armies and the military. Then it became, rockets and computers. So I don't think this is just somebody sitting in a room, right, saying, okay, this is what I think, right? If every major power in the world is competing for silicon chips, for space flight capability, for automobile and aerospace manufacturing and steel and strategic minerals, then I assume they know what they're doing. And and if everyone else is playing chess, we can't play checkers, right? We're a shrinking power in terms of population and global market share. And we are no longer going to set the rules of the world. And if the world is going to play this multipolar military mercantilist game, then either we become isolationist and sit it out and hope that somehow we can flourish, or we play by the rules that the others are playing by.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. So before we conclude this evening, I have two announcements. First, I'd like to thank the EPPC staff who made this event possible, Helen Schleter and Ella Marone, who are our operations assistants, and Hunter Estes, our director of communications, who has been managing some of this online. Second, I want to invite everyone to our remaining two debates. The first will take place next Tuesday, December 10th at 5:30 p.m. in Caldwell Auditorium on the campus of the Catholic University of America, featuring Patrick Brown and Catherine Pekulik debating federal financial policy for families. The final debate will be 1 week later, Tuesday, December 17th at 5:30 p.m. in this room, featuring R.R. Reno and Avik Roy debating religious diversity and American national identity, and we hope you'll be able to join us for both of those. So once again, thank you and good evening.